Well, gosh, to welcome again Shawn Bryant, who is a wonderful colleague and privileged to know him over the years and appreciate so much all the training and opportunities he's provided for us here at First Five. And Shawn is a former Head Start teacher and mental health consultant and is a founding director of the Teaching Excellence Center. He has over 27 years of educational experience in urban, suburban, and rural school district and early learning centers. Much of Shawn's work supports teachers, programs, and leaders in planning, visioning, implementing, and evaluating large-scale improvement initiatives. He is a national speaker, trainer, and consultant. And you can learn more about Shawn by visiting his website, teachingexcellencecenter.com. Thank you so much, Shawn, for being here today. Really glad you're here and bringing these experts over these last two trainings to us. So welcome.
Thank you, Beth, and good morning to everyone. Welcome back and welcome to another Learning with Training at First Five. And always thank you to Beth and Leah for their tireless work behind the scenes. A lot goes into making all of these sessions come alive. So we're jumping right into part two, addressing elephants in the room. Racism is going to be the awareness building topic today. So I want to say welcome and good morning, good afternoon. Some people are in some other cities because of COVID to everyone. Thank you again for spending your time with us today. And thank you to those who are returning from part one to part two. And remember, if you did not catch all of part one, it is archived on First Five Alameda County's YouTube page. So you can go back and review it on YouTube individually, or if you're a director, a coach, a specialist, you can sit with a team. If you're a teaching team or an agency team, you can review it as part of your internal professional development also. It's always there for you to pull from. Your time and attention matters to us, and we appreciate you coming back. So we really want everyone to get as comfortable as you can, wherever you are in your seat. Get you some water, something to take notes with, some tea, whatever you need to make yourself comfortable in this learning experience and exchange. So we just really want to capture, before we jump right in, the question and answer box is where we want you to drop all of your questions. In the chat box is where you can make comments and responses, but the questions for the facilitators, the presenters, please put them in the Q&A box because they're monitored that way. Thank you. And if you're having trouble, a few people had trouble last week, it's because if you don't have the most up-to-date version of Zoom, it will sometimes give you problems. Okay. So for those who don't know, I'm Shawn Bryant. This is my 27th year in early childhood and elementary education. You can find more about me at teachingexcellencecenter.com, Twitter, Facebook, which is my new therapy, Pinterest, because I don't have to pay $150 per session. Now today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're taking a deeper dive. We want you all to interact with us, First Five at Alameda and ECE Teaching at Twitter and on Facebook. And the hashtag is Elephants, Racism, Equity. So we want you to really go there and tweet and post on Facebook some of your learning today. And at the end, Beth and Leah and myself will look at the tweets and we're going to pick some tweet winners. We have some really great gifts for you all. These are going to be surprise gifts for the best tweet. So make sure you tweet and post on Facebook and engage with us on social media. Again, the Tender and Tough Topics virtual series, which we've been unpacking this year, the ones you see starred with the red star are ones we've already offered through virtual learning at First Five, and they are archived on First Five Alameda County's YouTube page. So you can go there and view them anytime. We're really excited, like Beth said, about this upcoming training. We shifted the title a little bit, but it's really plain, responding to children experiencing stress, this deep thing called stress, and what we can do no matter who we are. If we're a nurse, a coach, a teacher, a para, a parent, a home visitor, a manager, a grandparent, if we're anyone involved in the lives of young children can benefit from this 4-session training. It's going to be interactive. We developed it to be intentionally strategy-based. We're going to have some small groups. It's going to be a huge learning lift so that you walk away after each one with your bag filled. Again, today, we're raising awareness and we're learning some new skills in this virtual learning together. Again, we want you to pause the process. One thing I want you all to take away from this is that a lot of the feedback last week, people talked about their discomfort. And the piece about discomfort is that's a part of it. If you feel discomfort, that means you're on the right path. So the discomfort that people were talking about that they were uncomfortable with is actually part of the process. So when you experience that or hear something that doesn't seem like it's really what you experience, those things are okay. And at the end, we're gonna figure out like what that actually means for us as individuals who live and negotiate space within larger systems. So if you can, consider these thinking stems and activate them throughout this session today. So we're gonna jump right in. Last week, you were introduced to these 3 tenets under bias-based beliefs. And we know that bias-based beliefs, they operate in all types of settings. They operate in our schools, in our preschools, in our healthcare facilities, in our colleges and universities, in our after-school programs, at nonprofits, at for-profits, community centers, within our neighborhoods, even within our families sometimes, our places of worship, our staff meetings, our parent-teacher conferences. And research confirms that these bias-based beliefs often operate simultaneously. That means they're happening and occurring with other things. And we all have these biases, which is what we often say. And this is problematic as it pertains to bias-based beliefs because it actually perpetuates racist thinking, explicit and implicit. That means racist thinking that's externalized and racist thinking that's just inside of me. Bias-based beliefs actually set the stage for deeper practices, processes, and policies, which is why we need to unearth how they run oftentimes dormant in our daily lives. Bias-based beliefs actually consider and believe that culture is static, and culture is not static, it's actually quite fluid. It believes that culture is static and it helps to connect people's personal beliefs to the biased thinking and behaviors, which is why we have to understand how these things activate in our lives. So understanding these bias-based beliefs and how they operate is part of the work. That's part of the awareness building, is part of the learning and part of the challenge. There are huge challenges for those on the call who are leaders, is for you to understand how bias-based beliefs work and to create mechanisms to challenge and change them within your school, your program, or your agency, okay? So we know that 3 key tenets are important in this change. So that first tenet is self-efficacy, self-efficacy. And we're gonna define that in just a moment. That second tenet is creating and using equity principles. So if you don't know what equity principles are, maybe you need to Google them, maybe you can form a team at your work or your school and create some equity principles for your agency. That third tenet is healthier climates and cultures for marginalized people. Okay, so those are the 3 large tenets: self-efficacy, creating and using equity principles, and healthier climates and cultures for marginalized people. Bias-based beliefs actually readily present this notion of less self-efficacious thinking and behaviors. So basically it's saying that adults who actually lean into bias-based beliefs actually demonstrate less self-efficacy. So some of you may know Albert Bandura was the person who created this concept a few decades ago. And basically what he proposed was that how well we can execute a course of action that's required for us to deal with circumstances or situations. And these circumstances and situations are ones that are really about us developing the ability to hold negative capacity about ourselves. So the ability to hold negative capacity about ourselves. So this is why it's so important to understand these bias-based beliefs, because so often our ability to hold the negative capacity is saying, I know my biases, and we move on. Here's the problem, because underneath that, we could be unknowingly or sometimes knowingly perpetuating racist thinking and behaviors. All right. Here for us today, these circumstances and situations are actually racial. So I included this graphic and this is from the Office of Civil Rights, the United States Office of Civil Rights, which looks at a few things, but I put this one up around suspension of young children. And what they found was the darker the male and female skin color, the more those children were suspended. So when we think of colorblindness or we think of colorism, this gives us something to consider, not just at school, but I would even contend in our places of work and our places of worship. All right, so we're going to jump right in. Colorblindness. So we introduced colorblindness, deficit thinking last week. So basically colorblindness is enacted as us not judging individuals based on skin color, that the individual is the issue, not the system. The individual is the issue, not the system. All right, colorblindness removes social identity and lived experience. And it emerged basically after the civil rights era as a new form of racial ideology. So according to Edward Bonilla Silva, he said that this thing actually has 3 features, okay? That it was believed to be the best form of removing racism is to remove race, gender, ability, and other social descriptors. You all hear how problematic that is? The second feature was that treating people as individuals without social identities. You can't treat me as an individual. My social identities are to my family, to my other subgroups. All of those pieces make me who I am, but treating me as an individual removes all of that from the equation, which means I'm expected to function in a system so that you can then say, Shawn, I don't see your color. How can you not miss it? The third feature is focusing on commonalities. And that led to rationalizing racial inequalities. And the piece that why I'm presenting this is we all need to get the deeper piece that we miss is that because we're all functioning in these systems, we miss that it's all a part of the system. It's not by mistake, it's all a part of the system. So then we start enacting these things on students, on children, on families, on our colleagues, coworkers, because it's inside. All right. So these commonalities kind of make assertions that Black, Latino, Black, Indigenous people of color have natural tendencies for what they do. See, is colorblindness. And here we just listed basically on the screen, you see some bullets around colorblindness, that its mission is to sustain the cultural frame of whiteness when considering everything, that the goal is for everybody to see it through this one way. It omits the presence of social realities that are different from the white social identity. So who you are really doesn't matter. You need to somewhat become like the other. It prevents the system from acknowledging how historical and structural and all those things translate into my everyday life because it limits access and opportunity. And of course, colorblindness seeks to understand racism as an individual act, not as a system. So let's build on that. So that second piece related to bias-based beliefs is deficit thinking. So Richard Valencia kind of defined it in 1997, and I appreciated his definition. But this deficit-based thinking, according to Valencia, is what he calls the type of cognition that is simple and efficient form of attributing the causes of human behavior. So we're going to talk about that. And those causes are all deficit-based. So this deficit thinking paradigm includes things like genetic pathology, the culture of poverty. And these are things that many of you have probably heard in your professional and educational careers, and the marginalization of low income and Black and Indigenous people of color, okay? So this deficit thinking was actually spurred in many areas. And one of those areas was this notion of interracial marriage in places like California, Louisiana, where it was illegal and existed until 1967. Just the hop, skip, and a jump right before I was born. Remnants of this historical deficit thinking remain. And the reason why those things were put into law was because the larger notion was that if a white person intermarried with a person that wasn't white, that genetic pathology said that deficit thinking said that that other person was less than you and you were going to procreate and create lesser humans. This is where deficit thinking stems from. You know, we enact it differently today, but the roots of it is what we have to understand to rid it of our schools and our workplaces, okay? So it remains and it resurfaces as a response to child behavior. It results in preschool expulsion. It results in elementary school suspensions and zero tolerance, racial profiling, the lack of leadership of people of color in schools, colleges, universities, community-based agencies are just some examples. Deficit thinking asserts that it's the deficiencies of the cultural attributes and practices that prevent Black and Indigenous people of color from assimilating and attaining social mobility at work, school, and in life. Largely, it believes that it's the failure of Black and Latinx people to internalize the white work ethic. And this really plays out at work and at school for many, many people. So we've got to understand it to do something about it. So that third piece of bias-based beliefs is poverty beliefs and behaviors. So oftentimes when people hear this, they think, oh, it's similar to deficit thinking. However, poverty beliefs and behaviors consider changing the behavior and psychological dispositions or thinking as paramount to fixing low-income Black and Indigenous people of color and how we view school and work. So think of it this way. Deficit thinking focuses on beliefs about ability. Poverty beliefs and behaviors seek to change how Black and Latinx and people of color see themselves within the racist system negatively. Things like school discipline, detention, again, suspension, transferring to another school, at work, creating a work plan for this staff person or employee, micromanaging, false beliefs that my supervisor is my colleague, are all designed from a deficit and poverty lens, okay? And they seek to basically say, you're not worthy and I feel okay because I've helped oppress you, but I convinced myself that I was helping you. Poverty, beliefs, and behaviors. So a strategy is for you to consider these questions and create, a reflection journal for yourself. Because what we find is that in this work, reflecting and journaling is a pathway for us to examine our unchecked, our unchallenged, and our unchanged biases that are rooted in colonization and racism. So really that first question, which I really highly, you can take this as an individual, you can take this back to your group and do lots with these reflective questions around who are we prioritizing, around anti-racism and anti-bias, and how are we prioritizing those things? Are we not letting people opt out of this if we're saying we're participating in the professional development and that this is a part of work and we understand why it's a part of work? How are we centering Black and Indigenous people of color at our school and our agencies? How are we supporting Black and Indigenous people of color? And how are we making sure that that support that we create has a lasting effect and lasting change within our school or our agency? So here is just a graphic that some health professionals at Surgery Redesign created, and I'm sharing it because it is a PDF that I can share also. They go through the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. And some of you may have seen this graphic in other ways, but I just appreciated it. And I said, oh, this may be really helpful for folk who are going through that process of anti-racism. So I wanted to leave you with some supports. So one of the supports are Showing Up for Racial Justice. It's a website. They have a few programs and a lot of excellent resources in those drop-down menus. They actually just did a webinar yesterday that really talked about being white versus whiteness and how they were different. And it was really for white identified people, and it was presented by 3 white panelists. And I listened and it was quite interesting. Another resource is this anti-racism resource, and the link, the shorter link is there. a list of a plethora of things to dive into in terms of book reading, videos, articles to go deeper. Just this in June, so website, and if you look, there's a 10-minute, a 25-minute, and a 45 minutes, meaning these are your reflective. They're giving you things to do each day, and you add on to it if you're just stepping into this work as a natural process for people. It's quite extensive, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. And for agencies and leaders that are looking to do this work at a much more expansive rate, I would highly recommend you check out Race Forward's Racial Equity Readiness Assessment for Workforce Development. You have to sign up for it on the site, but I highly recommend you take a look at that. And for all my early childhood folk who are early childhood specific, this is just one brief resource of social justice books, but on the site, the list goes on and on and on. But this is just a way for you to enter the work. A lot of people last week who are in early childhood specifically raised the question that they wanted early childhood strategies. So let me explain before I have like 6 minutes left. We decided to raise awareness, and we didn't want to be strategy specific for a number of reasons, particularly in education and early childhood. What we often do is we show up with a list of strategies for teachers. And I think when we do that, we're doing a number of things. We're robbing teachers of the ability to think. I think that certain times that's oppressive. And then what we also see is we'll show up with 10 strategies or 10 things, and then the teacher will say, well, I don't like these 5 at all. These 3 seem okay. And we try one, and then we say, I tried that one. So to prevent that from happening so that it's authentic, the goal was to raise awareness for people to be reflective in this process of last week and this week to figure out how to do those things within that work. That was the purpose of last week and this week. This wasn't a strategies workshop. But we did hear you. We did hear you. And I talked to Dr. Nunley, who actually spent her birthday on the phone with 2 hours with a number of people, helping them to dig deeper into her presentation. I've talked to Salika and Tara. So one of the things that we're looking at doing outside of First 5 offering this is September, October, November, and December, offering longer sessions featuring early childhood folk, early elementary professionals who are doing this work, and to spotlight them virtually so that you can see and hear what people are really doing. So look out for that coming from Teaching Excellence Center. I want to leave you with this quote that I really, really enjoy. So he says, being actively anti-racist is not a cognitive process. It is a somatic one. Healing white body supremacy is not something we think our way out of. It must be somatically addressed to be healed. And I think this is deeper than them just putting out words. We must begin noticing what happens in our bodies as we listen, learn, and look at the ways we have been complicit. It's quite powerful. Be curious about what sensations and feelings arise, what reactions or defenses show up, and allow those experiences in your viscera in a tirade way. Basically, that's like your abdomen and your intestines, what you feel inside of you, and let them process through so that you can become free of them. That's part of the work. So I think that was quite powerful. And I wanted to leave you all with that. So there's one question that I see in the Q&A box before I introduce our presenters today about deficit thinking, how it manifests. Can you give more examples? So there are tons of examples of deficit-based thinking around this notion of, so I'll give you an example, a real life example of a teacher in the Bay Area, a principal in the Bay Area who took all the new teachers on a bus tour throughout the low-income neighborhoods. This is really what happened of the children who were in that school as a way to say, see where they come from, have empathy for them. That was deficit-based thinking, because the notion was you're going to see these dilapidated places where these children live, so feel sympathy for them. And it does not at all spotlight those family strengths, those neighborhood strengths, and the strengths of those children and what they bring academically and socially and culturally. So that's a huge example of what we often do. And this principal actually took them on a bus tour, like they're waving and things. That's an example of a real lived deficit-based thinking example and how it was enacted on children and families and communities. So to remove, I heard you saying it was a little abstract for you, because the notion was to raise awareness so that we can consider how these things show up in our practices and our programs. Thank you for the question. Oh, someone said model minority is based on biased thinking. Definitely, definitely. It's all steeped in racist ideology. So thank you all for that. And thank you all. I received emails from folk last week who wanted to go deeper, and I appreciate all of those. And again, as you consider the evaluation, be reflective and think about not, as the quote says, not reacting, but what really, really happened for me that's meaningful. Or as Rick Hansen says, just one thing. What am I taking away that can be really, really useful for me in my work and my life? All right, so I'm going to introduce to you both of our presenters today. Our first presenter is going to be Nnenna Odim. She's currently at the University of Texas, Austin, in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, Early Childhood Education, Dynamic Innovations for Young Children, and the Agency and Young Children Research Collective. Whew, okay, that was all under her title. She's currently a doctoral student, an instructor and research assistant and thinker of play and play practices. She really considers the experiences of Black children and how children negotiate and resist the tenets of hierarchy and power in early learning environments and early learning spaces that illustrate the complexities of normal and elevate Black joy. Nnenna is going to be presenting today on early learning environments as anti-racist spaces for Black children. So personally, Nnenna is a colleague and friend of mine who I met years ago. We both had traveled with Harvest Resources with, who was it? Margie Carter and Ileana Elias, who's actually in the Bay Area, to New Zealand. And we became really great colleagues and friends from that cultural exchange. So we're going to welcome her. And then when Nnenna finishes, we're going to have Dr. G.T. Reyes, who's an assistant professor at Cal State University East Bay. And he's a community engaged scholar, activist, organizer, practitioner. I know he's a former principal. He coaches school leaders, and he's really rooted in critical social, cultural, and ethnic study discourses that forefront culturally sustaining and radical healing pedagogies. He's going to present on These Are the Breaks, Bravery as Liberatory Critical Race Pedagogy. And Dr. G is not new to First Five. For those who may have participated in the Fathers Course First Summit in downtown Oakland, he was one of the panel members at that summit. So we're going to welcome Dr. G also. So I'm going to move out of the way, and then Nnenna's going to come on and start her session. So I'm muting my sound, Nnenna.
Thank you, Shawn. Gosh, the descriptions are beautiful. It reminds me of how much work we have been doing and how much longer we are going to be doing this work. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Gosh, Shawn, there's so many resources that you were sharing. I'm going to be talking a lot about some of those books and how the knowledge is in the classroom with young children. So good afternoon, everyone. I join you from Chicago, where I am in solidarity with the quest to have stolen land, rivers, and lakes returned to the elders, past and emerging, of the Kickapoo, Peoria, the Miami, the Sioux, the Potawatomi, the Illinois peoples that are of this land where I am. And I know that we have people joining from all over. And so I join Indigenous and ancestral knowledge to develop these slides, the knowledge that I'm sharing and the discussions that we're going to be having today, and how you can develop anti-racist spaces that are early learning spaces as well. And I include in the session today images of beautiful Black children who are experiencing all of these uprisings, current and previous uprisings, to recognize their humanity. And my goal is to expand our conversations around how to support early learning spaces for Black children to feel joy, to heal from these systems that demean their contributions, and to recognize their knowledge and their presence, and create environments where they can thrive. Just like this little boy who knows that his life matters. And of course it does. And to live in an environment that forces you to take to the streets and yell that it matters is one that needs to be changed. So especially in early learning environments. So I'm glad that you are here with us today. And as you listen, as Shawn was naming, to be reflective on what is your work? How do you show that you care about young Black children and young children in a world that is showing them that they do not care? So I invite you to come along with me. And today, our topics for this session, and we're going to discuss race. We'll look at how the characteristics of anti-racist early learning spaces show up. We'll do a little check-in to see how you are feeling, and then focus in directly on Black children. And then, of course, a few helpful resources before we hear from Dr. G. And so I want to start with, in 2017, Beverly Daniel Tatum wrote about conversations of race in her book, Can We Talk About Race? And in this, she focuses specifically on schools. And in this book, she says, the question is not really, are you racist, but are you actively working to make the system equitable for everyone? So today, I ask you to keep that question in mind. How are you actively working to make the system equitable for everyone, especially beautiful Black children? So as we talk about anti-racist spaces in early learning for young Black children, I might bring in some personal examples, or you might think of some personal examples, or there might be a word that you don't know or understand. But again, I ask you to focus on systems that are within your reach, that you can change, that you have some say in, and that you can personally act in. Otherwise, you continue to strengthen racist systems, like Black moms who are dying at an exceptionally higher rate during pregnancy, or Black children who are suspended at exceptionally high rates. So if you are not thinking about actively working against the system, you are strengthening the system. So keep that in mind as we go through the slides. And anti-racist spaces, I love thinking about early learning and race, because children are constantly learning and noticing race from an early age. And as you talk about race and differences, you help build a foundation for embracing those differences. And children begin to understand what they see and what they hear in the world around them. And in this way, you begin to develop spaces where difference is only that, and it's beautiful. So instead of current spaces where differences are based in racialized distribution of resources like education and healthcare and fresh food options, and if you are talking about race while naming these institutions of inequity like education and healthcare and food with young children, all the better. They get to know about their world in context. So I ask you to join with me. But if you're not talking about race with young children in ways where they can notice differences as a crucial part of community, again, you are strengthening racist early learning spaces. And our goal today, and why you're joining us, is to think about making these early learning spaces equitable for all children, of course, and focusing on Black children in this session. So talk about race with young children. Name race as a factor in how education is shared in our country so that we can change it. Gosh, I'm excited, y'all, because there are also a lot of books that you can fall into with young children. So as we talk about race, these are helpful resources of the experiences of race in the United States. Bring in Native experiences, Indigenous people's experiences, Latina experiences, Latinx experiences, because anti-race spaces for young Black children include anti-racist spaces for Indigenous children as well, because this country's racist histories have included many groups of people. So I share these books because I remember I was a kindergarten teacher in Gainesville, Florida, and sometimes when you don't know what to say, falling into a book with young children can cultivate spaces for children to talk. And they guide the conversation, because anti-racist early learning spaces listen to children. You hear their thoughts, which can address some of these power dynamics that are within the adult-child interaction, the adult-human interaction, so that we move to something else. So I am not a number is a description of how young Indigenous experiences in boarding schools and reclaiming your power against the racist system. So I share these as a few examples. But as we talk about how necessary it is to discuss race in early learning spaces to create these anti-racist spaces that we want, I want you to know how I enter the conversation. So this is a picture of me. These are my cousins, my brother, myself, who I've grown up with my entire life. And I'm in the middle, of course, and I continue to make similar faces today. But I show up as a Black woman with immigrant parents. On my mom's side, we are from the Arawak peoples in the Caribbean. And my dad's side, I'm from Igbo. So I bring all of these knowledges to my experiences as a Black woman. My family is a mix of races and complexions, and I stand in my experience as a Black woman. I show up when I'm driving as a Black woman. I am a kindergarten teacher for 10 years, and so I bring in experience in the classroom with policy while working on migration research in school now. And I show up as a Black woman in the United States because race matters in the United States. It's built on that. And so I want to talk with young children about my experiences. And so I want you to know how I enter this conversation, because it's important to have a community and to know where your community is coming from. So as you talk and think, how are you entering this conversation? How are you seeing difference? How are you seeing the range of emotions with young children, their contributions to early learning spaces? Because Black is so many things, so many emotions, that an anti-racist early learning space responds to those differences. And so let's think about how you enter anti-racist spaces, this conversation around race. How are you racialized in this world? So take a few minutes just to, on your notepad that Shawn was suggesting, how are you racialized in this world? And by this, I mean racial groups, like which racial groups would someone see you from? Which identities do you share with Black children? I ask these questions because it's central to this conversation. How open you are and how you connect with Black children is foundational to creating anti-racist spaces for Black children. So I'm going to give you a minute to just think about, a few seconds, honestly, to think about how you enter this conversation. How are you racialized in this world, and how do you connect? How do you see an overlap with young Black children? All right, and of course, in this conversation about race, I am based in womanist and Black feminist frameworks. So I bring two theories together. The first is intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She coined this term where there are many of our identities that intersect at the exact same time. So this brightly colored circle includes some examples of identities like race and age and ethnicity and physical abilities and language fluency, among many other ways that we all identify. Intersectionality is the notion that these identities lead to multiple oppressions, especially for Black women and girls. So race does not stand alone. Like, I am a Black woman in a racist healthcare system. So I experienced limited opportunities to jobs, and I die at dramatically higher rates in childbirth, all because of a racist society. So young Black children experience higher suspension rates, and teachers who ignore their contributions because of a society, a racialized society that's built on a notion that whiteness deserves ownership, deserves to name. And so each of us holds privileges and experiences oppression based on our identities. And so I want us to kind of name where we are noticing privileges and where we're noticing oppressions so that we can talk about it. As you think about your inner identities, I join intersectionality with Alexis Pauline Gump's and Danny McLean's notions of mothering, because they see children as strengthening community, because we are focusing on the ways that we respond to them, to young children, and the nurturing of a child's need is a way that we build community. That's why we're all here together today. So anti-racist early learning spaces nurture and care for Black children like their mother would. And so as you think about these spaces, think about how a mother would care for their children, how a parent would care for their child, so that that helps you characterize early learning spaces. And as I focus in on mothering, I think about Black mothering. In We Live for the We, Danny McLean talks about Black moms and the amount of hope that you must hold in order to bring a beautiful Black child in this world currently guided by such anti-Black policies. So there's a hope that the world will see your beautiful child the same way you do, and want to take care of and nurture and protect that beautiful Black child. So despite seeing and hearing atrocious and life-sucking examples of anti-Blackness in the number of school suspensions or police brutality of young Black people, we still hold hope. And in this image, a Black mom holds a sign saying, "We are not carrying for 9 months and then struggling through labor for 9 hours for you to just kneel on their necks for 9 minutes." And so people wanting to create anti-racist early learning spaces will learn more about invisible load of Black mothering. As you define that for yourself, you learn about what other mothers are holding. And so as you think about that and young children, imagine a young child, because I feel like we have to center young children, focus on young children as we talk about these spaces for young children. You're standing in a line at the grocery store. You're thinking about, okay, did you get everything you need? You make sure your cart is full of all the items, and you glance in front of you and you notice a beautiful little girl, maybe about 2.5 years old. Her legs are gushing with mounds of skin and chub, of course, showing that someone has cared in feeding her. She looks up at you, she smiles, showing you her entire teeth, flops her legs back and forth, rocking and looking over, noticing, oh, there's a green container of Mentos. She smiles at you. And then next to that green container, there's maybe a Magnolia magazine with Joanna Gaines on the cover. And then next to that, there is an inviting, of course, caramel package. Well, for me, it's inviting, of Twix, reminding you to take a walk when you get home. And so as you think about young children, this young child that I just named, what images came up for you? What complexion did she have in your mind? That is telling. How we imagine children shows how we treat children that are in front of us, that are around us. And so as you cultivate an anti-racist space for young Black children, ask yourself, interrogate your thinking about young children, your imaginations of young children. Because if in your imagination it was not a Black child, why was that? You don't need to tell me, of course, or to be honest with you be honest with yourself, really, is as we talk about characteristics of early learning spaces, if you imagined someone other than a Black girl, it's gonna take some work for us to create anti-racist spaces for Black children. Nurturing and taking care of Black children means imagining them, imagining the joy that they have in order to then create spaces where that can thrive. And so I think that also our imaginations are related to policy, of course. So as we talk about education and your imagination, they are deeply impacted and connected. That little girl that you thought of, and that is directly related to how you see yourself and the identities that we were talking about and intersectionality we were talking about, let's take a few minutes to learn more about your educational experiences. And so Leah, we're gonna start the poll. And this is really about how you connected with teachers. Here's a poll to learn more about our collective experiences with young teachers. So go ahead and complete the poll. And then Leah, maybe when we get a good amount, we can share with everyone to see at what age we experience certain types of teachers that look certain ways.
We're still seeing lots of activity with the poll, so I'll leave it open for a little bit.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, please complete so we can understand collectively how we're experiencing education. And maybe
people to scroll down the poll. More questions.
Thank you. Yes, scroll down to get a few questions because it's really about knowing the background of the teachers that you had. Is there better activity, Leah?
Yep, we've got about almost 50% of the people have voted so far.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll give maybe another 30 seconds. And then we can close it out and let's see what kind of experiences we've all had with teachers.
Okay, I'll close the poll in about 5 seconds.
Great, thank you.
should be seeing the poll result.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So it looks like you've had teachers who look like you, a majority, 61%, had teachers that looked like you. At what age did you have a teacher who was Indigenous? 46% said never. At what age did you have a teacher who was Latina or Latinx? Our largest is in college, with 24%. At what age did you have a teacher who was Asian and Pacific Islander? 28% said never. So our experiences with teachers is a mix of not seeing authority that is from different backgrounds. And so this has a say in how you then define authority. And it makes you think authority is from a certain background. So I want us to have a collective understanding that authority for some reason means that it's going to look a certain way. And that means young children are growing up with knowing that an authority or thinking an authority looks a certain way, and that's directly related to policies. And policies that had wonderful intentions, but the impact was dramatic and in some ways negative. So unfortunately, authority has looked white in the United States, in our US educational system. Your experiences that you shared in the poll are absolutely related to a racist educational system. According to a study that was supporting the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, schools were mandated to desegregate the student body. But the law did not protect the jobs of Black teachers and administrators. So 38,000 Black teachers and administrators in 21 Southern districts were fired, lost their jobs. So based on the findings of this study, desegregating schools did not protect Black teachers and teachers of different backgrounds, leading to this underrepresentation. Of course, there's many other factors, but one of them was this underrepresentation of teaching staff, a teaching force of multiple backgrounds. So as you begin to absorb anti-racist approaches to listening to children, be aware of how intentions and impact are two separate things. Intentions might mean you buy the book, you learn the quotes, you name the quotes for other people, but impact means you take what you've learned in those books to then change conversations in your work meetings, at school district council meetings, or voting with Black and Indigenous collective interests in mind. Impact means that you think about us even when the book is done, even when it's not convenient, because it has an impact. It has a say in our collective freedoms. And so as I think about collective freedoms, I look to Bettina Love and her book of We Want to Do More Than Survive, which asks teachers and educators to acknowledge that anti-Blackness exists in schools. So that means every moment you have an opportunity to create an anti-racist space, every single moment. One very simple example is you're aware, of course, of the light bulb. Like, history with young children is a very specific moment that you can make an impact. So with the light bulb, we all know that Thomas Edison created the light bulb, but he used paper filament, which burned out really quickly. The light bulb that you know today that burns continuously has carbon filament, which was invented in 1881, by a Black man named Lewis Latimer. This is a Black child's history. So in her book, Love talks about education and the way that it murders the spirit of young Black children, because they come to school and they're ready, but they do not see their culture affirmed or reflected in books, in teaching staff. in the eyes of the adults around them. Love says that is a slow death of murdering a child's spirit. And anti-racist early learning spaces see a Black child's history, includes Latimer, in how you talk about history. You notice their humanity, you notice their beauty, and you include them in stories and histories because they are brilliant. And that is how an anti-racist space sees young Black children. Gosh, I'm getting, just thinking about it, imagining it makes me so excited. So now that we have kind of a historical perspective with your experiences in education, let's talk about some characteristics of anti-racist early learning spaces for Black children. There are many, absolutely many, and today I'm going to focus on 3. Uplifting the beauty, the brilliance, and the local knowledges of Black children, recognizing that every single space with children is an early learning space, and naming and using your privilege to improve the lives of Black children. So I'm going to go over each one, but I wanted you to get an understanding of what I'll be talking about as anti-racist spaces for Black children. So Bagele Chalesa writes about the ways that communities hold and share what they know. And she calls this local knowledges. And it's the local knowledge of community, in community. Black children bring their experiences with them, their family knowledge with them to the interactions with you. They bring their power, their desire for support to their interactions with you. And so as you engage early learning anti-racist spaces, listen to children, embrace the notion of Black mothering from Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Danny McLean. Look and nurture, love and nurture Black children as their mom would. Include their histories in examples like the light bulb, and know that every single Black child is different. Every single Black person, of course, is different, which requires you to listen and respond in every
Hi, everyone. It seems like we may have had a freezing. So there we are again.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Now we can hear you. Yes, yes, we can hear you. I wonder, I don't know what happened. Maybe bring your PowerPoint back up and we'll go back to where we were.
Yeah, so weird. Okay.
Yeah, this is what happens. This is life online. Thank you so much.
All right, let's get back. Let's get back. So, did you hear me talk about beyond the precarity?
More of that. We did not hear that.
Great. Okay. So in the book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, Christina Sharp describes life beyond the precarity, where Black life is joyful and cared for, where we look through the systems of inequity that ravage our communities and intend to destroy us, and focus on how Black life engages joy and humanity. And so lately I have been engaging children's books, storybooks, falling into stories and authors who see the brilliance of young children. And I was reading this children's storybook called Auntie Luce's Talking Paintings by Francie Latour. And I noticed the same theme of looking beyond the precarity. In this book, a young girl visits her aunt who is a painter, and they talk about the histories of the Haitian rebellion, for freedom, and the pain that governmental militaries cause the families and the Haitian people. She says, I paint to remember what I've seen and heard and smelled and felt. To paint Haiti takes the darkest colors and the brightest colors and all the colors in between, developing AntiRacist Spaces asks adults to take all of the colors in between, to nurture children by looking at all the aspects of their lives, the vibrant times and the precarious times, to see their humanity. AntiRacist Spaces for Black children look beyond the precarity of racist systems while actively fighting to change them, to change the way that Black children can be demeaned and ignored in the classroom. So have those images in your mind, because this book is gorgeous. So if you have an opportunity, Auntie Luce's Talking Paintings, it shares the multiplicity of Blackness. A second characteristic is to recognize that every single space is an anti-racist early learning space. It's an opportunity for an anti-racist early learning space. Like, it's everywhere that children exist. Classrooms, grocery stores, walking on the sidewalk, on the train, at the park. These are all spaces where Black children exist and spend time, which means this is an opportunity to support Black life. So in this way, you see Black children as part of their parents, part of their families, part of communities, and you take opportunities to be an ally, to be a supporter in every single space. Now, this term ally, of course, has problematics with it, but it's really focusing on how you support Black life. And Shawn, and I know last week they went into examples of ally, and I want to clarify how I'm using it. It's really about supporting Black life and using your privilege to make space for others. So an ally is someone who takes more than a role. They take their role seriously by naming the structures that are in play. So not just naming the books, popular books about race, or listing out vocabulary, or knowing the popular authors to read, but an ally uses their privilege to make space for others and protect the life of others. So I know that we've heard it in many different contexts, but Beverly Daniel Tatum describes privilege as an experience that you might not notice because it can be taken for granted. And so white privilege is the assumption that you will feel comfortable in many situations. And as Shawn was naming, part of anti-racist spaces means you need to feel discomfort. And so as a white person, you benefit from racist spaces. And so it is up to you to use your privilege to make space for others. Some examples: if you hear a racist or demeaning conversation, stop it and name it for whoever is in that conversation. In meetings, bring up diversity so that the person of color is not bringing up diversity. Great. And if you notice a Black colleague's contributions have been ignored, restate their comment and give them credit, because being anti-racist or creating environments, cultivating environments that are anti-racist means you're intentional about how you interact with people, especially children in racialized groups. So learn with their families, listen to their families. And anti-racist spaces, again, uplift the beauty, the brilliance, and local knowledges of Black children. They recognize that every space with children is an early learning space. They name and use privilege to improve the lives of Black children, Black and Indigenous children. And so although there are many characteristics, those are the three that I wanted to focus on. And as I close out, I return to the question, how will you actively work to make the system equitable and anti-racist for everyone, especially beautiful, look at that smile and sand on his forehead, especially young Black children? How will you use your privilege to cultivate spaces of joy for Black children? And I wanted to share a few resources because I love books so much. And of course, we are all on internet right now. So there's some helpful resources about race for children. Google, this is one time where Google's algorithms are helpful. And so you can always, when I did a quick search, there were really helpful websites that you can also search for. There's beautiful books, y'all. Artists and authors are noticing the brilliance of young Black children and Blackness. And so sometimes children want to hear directly from their communities. That might mean it's time to fall into a book with young children. And here are a few options. And then there are a few more options that I wanted to share because I'm loving storybooks right now, y'all. So I wanted to share it with you. And then that is all that I have. Thank you so much. Here's my email if you do have any questions and topics that I am most interested in, that I have been researching, is ancestral knowledges and early learning and Black geographies, and really storybooks. So I appreciate you for listening and kind of going on this journey with me, imagining beautiful Black children in early learning spaces.
Thank you, Nnenna. Thank you. So there are a few questions, really just 2, maybe 3. So the first question says, how do you help children who are Black or triracial? That's the first question. Do you want me to read them all or just stop?
Yeah, why don't you read them all so we can see if there's...
So the second question, which came up a few times in the chat and in the question, was this notion of people found the poll question difficult for them. And I feel like you have a response to that. They said they were educated either outside the US in their home country and immigrated to the US. So they felt like it was skewed for them. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah.
Someone gave you a thank you for including their Haitian culture. And I guess the last question is the difference between make space and take space. And listening is a great way to make space. Maybe you can add to that. Those are really the questions.
Yeah, okay, so I will start with the experiencing education in multiple realms, outside of the United States, inside of the United States. Thank you for naming that. That is how I've experienced education as well. And I think that naming who you see as figures in education, who you see as authorities in education is important. And having a diversity of examples, I see as necessary for children to understand authority can be seen in many different ways. And honestly, I've noticed that authority is seen in a particular way in many different countries. And so I think that having a diversity of who you see, who you talk to when you have a question, who you engage when you're not sure about something is important for all children, but I think it's especially important for Black children to see Black teachers who care about them in their early learning spaces. I think it's important for Asian, for whatever your background is, for you to see people who look like you in those authority, in those figures, positions of authority. And so I would say ultimately a diversity of teachers is what's needed in early learning spaces.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. I know I'm trying to process all of that. It also, a lot of the storybooks that I named are examples of early learning spaces outside of the United States as well. Because I think when we're in the United States, we focus so often on the United States, but because migration happened, we have children who are from all over the world coming into early learning spaces. And so them being able to see themselves in books means that you as a teacher are remaining quiet and you're allowing the people from those communities to name what their experiences in early learning are like. And that's one approach to doing it. All right. What was another question, Shawn?
I think I dismissed it already. It was,
well,
it was about biracial and triracial children.
Oh yes, multiracial children. I think that, I guess I'd want to know more specifically about what, the crux of the question, because children have multiple identities, and how are we recognizing many of those identities in the early learning space so that so that children are feeling that they are heard on many different sides of who they are. I
think you just answered it. with
Got it.
multiple identities. I
Mhm.
think the question was really centered around, which is what the US has historically done in terms of categorization, which one box will you check?
Yeah.
So I think you answered it.
And that's what I think is so beautiful about early learning spaces, is that the differences are what make us, naming the systems that have created a difference that has funneled resources to specific communities is necessary in talking about early learning spaces, as well as noticing differences are beautiful, even though in this country they have been a tactic to diminish access. But differences are beautiful. And so, yeah, I think that having books and having discussions around that with young children is necessary in early learning.
Here's a last question, and we have like 2 minutes, and then it's Dr. G's turn. How do you set yourself apart or identify the space you're in, categories other than Black?
How do you identify yourself as other than Black?
No, it says, how do you set yourself apart or identify the space you're in / categories other than Black?
The multiplicity of Blackness. I mean,
maybe that's what she means.
well,
I don't want to speak for the questioner.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first I would ask, is the question about distancing yourself from Blackness? Like, what I would like to interrogate the need to distance yourself from Blackness. So often, policies that are directed or that negatively affect the Black community, if the structures are addressed, they would improve the conditions, material conditions for everyone. And so the way that naming and trying to separate from Black is anti-Blackness. And I think that if we interrogate what is the need to separate from Black, that would give us more material to understand how to address that.
Okay, so a bunch of questions are coming in. Dr. G, we're going to take one more, and then we're just going to hold the others. So an attendee said, can you address, this is in the Q&A box, a comment in the chat box where it says, I treat all children the same, and then someone else said, yes, I agree. And the person says, isn't that exactly what we're trying to change? So they want you to address that.
Yeah. I mean, if you're treating each child is different, and every single need of a child is different. And so if you are trying to meet the needs of children, then you are treating them differently. If you are listening to how children are talking, then you are meeting their needs. And so if you're not seeing them, I would say that that's one way that you're treating them all the same, if you're not actually listening to them. But if you're listening to children, their needs are different, which means you are treating them differently based on what they need. Do you understand what I'm?
I get it.
Yeah, no, I know. But you're the one that I can see in the video. Right. So I think that if you're meeting the needs of children, the notion of treating them the same falls away, because you're focusing on how each child is communicating to you. And so I would ask that the person, how are you learning about their need? How are you learning about how they need to be treated? How are you listening to how they need to be treated?
I'm going to say this, and then I need to give it to Dr. G so that he gets out his time and not frustrated with me. I'm going to say this. So Nnenna and I are both Black, but in many respects, I am African American and you aren't, in terms of our identities and how we came to be. My parents, my grandparents, great-grandparents were all born, and great-great-grandparents in this country. Yours were not. But in solidarity, we both will say we're Black, but you don't and aren't African American, in the sense of how I don't say I'm African American, but I can see why someone would classify me as African American. So those multiple identities where there is some commonality or sameness, when you dig deeper and pull the page back, what you see is what this landscape of uniqueness and individuality, which is what we're getting at.
Yeah, Black is not a monolith. There is so much diversity within African American, within people with dark complexions. There is a multiple ways that we can be seen, that we identify. And sometimes I think that allies, people who love to read the books and know the quotes, want to know how the terms. But accomplices, people who want to be in solidarity, are listening to you, Shawn, and see you, Shawn, is for what you need, and can listen to me, Nnenna, and see Nnenna for what I need, can see the multiplicity of how a person appears, and want to go on that path with you, want to go on that ride with you. I'm not trying to throw you all in the same bucket. So yes, I agree, Shawn. All right, Dr. G.
Now Dr. G's turn. Thank you, Nnenna.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank y'all for spending time.
So and don't worry, ECE Peak, we'll see Nnenna again in September, October, November, December. Don't worry, in a longer presentation specifically geared for us. So I'm going to introduce to some and present to others. Dr. G, I realized I missed this. I actually came to know Dr. G through his partner, who used to be a TK teacher in Oakland Unified School District. And I was his partner's coach when she was, a year before she got pregnant, and then she got pregnant. So however old your son is, it's the year older than him is how long I've known Bernadette and got to know Dr. G. So
That's right.
Let's give him the stage now, and I'm going to mute myself and leave the camera. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Shawn, and thank you, Nnenna, for both of you for like really opening up with an empowering, humanizing, and critical foundation for some of the things that I'd like to talk about and build upon. As Shawn already said, my name is Dr. G. Reyes. I'm coming to you from the homelands of the Wichino Ohlone, otherwise known as East Oakland, California. My mother's name is Erlinda Tiglao Reyes of the Taga-Ilogs and the Kapampangans from the northern part of the Philippines, specifically Tondo, Manila. My father is Fernando Palogud Reyes. He is also of the Taga-Ilogs and is coming from Pateros, Manila. I share this background with you because I always do this, but more importantly, I want to be transparent about why I do this, which is to model and preview an intentional process of, number one, visibilizing the invisibilized. In other words, what are the ways that our current society has invisibilized ways of thinking and ways of being, ways of doing, ways of becoming? So I'm trying to start this process of visibilizing that which has been invisibilized. I'll get into that more later. I also want to disrupt traditional ways of presenting. There's a lot of different ways that you may have experienced the ways in which people present and even how they look phenotypically. I want to disrupt that right off the bat. The third thing I want to do, the third reason why I start out this way, is to invoke a pedagogy of wholeness that Dr. Laura Rendon calls a senti pensante pedagogy. So I'll get into that a little bit later on as well. But what I want to do right now is building upon what Shawn said about my partner, Bernadette. I wanted to introduce my children here. So I'm going to share screen. This, that, and then boom. All right, so you should see this photo right here of my son. This is Davao Paulo, and Davao is named after the Moro warriors of the southern part of the Philippines. And specifically, we invoked this warriorness for my son because in utero, he had a mass detected in the lower left lobe of his lung, which he became then a high risk in terms of being born, if at all. And then at 6 months, they had to take out the mass from his lung so as to be able to remove any possibility, or at least really limit the possibility of having some type of cancer later on in life. And he's alive, well, and thriving right now. And so today I'm going to talk about these other breaks. Bravery is decolonial critical race pedagogy. And Shawn also alluded to this idea as being liberatory pedagogy. And I'll explain more about what that is. All right. You saw my son earlier. He's over here on the left. On the right side is my daughter, Mayeri Kalaya. Mayeri is named after the Filipina moon goddess and protector of women. And what you see here is you see us on Watakanian Kahaka land, or Mohawk territory in Northern Ontario. We went to a conference that really tried to reroute an indigenous practice, specifically for Filipino healers and educators who settle in various places along the Filipino diaspora. So there are many different features about this conference, but one that I'd like to lift up is that this space followed the landscape of the land. So instead of rectangle buildings and sidewalks and all these other industrious spaces, we were here in the natural environment. And so we were going up hills on rocks and different cabins in order to commune with each other. So we took a break from the conference to walk around and explore the land. And here we are in front of Gullwing Lake. So I bring this up to say that today I'm not going to do so much of like telling you about stuff, but what I want to do more of is sharing some knowledge through story, just like my elders. So I want to invoke First Nation scholar Terry Tafoya, who said stories go in circles. They don't go in straight lines. It helps if you listen in circles, because there are stories inside and between stories, and finding your way through them is as easy and as hard as finding your way home. Part of finding is getting lost. And when you're lost, you start to open up and listen. So I share this with you all to also say that when my family and I were on Watak land, I was really trying to gain intentional clarity as to why I was in this place in the first place, where I brought my kids across the country from California to Ontario, Canada, and then took a bus up to this land to then trudge with a suitcase over rocks and sometimes going uphill. And I realized that I had to invoke and nourish what Canadian Micmac OG scholar Marie Baptiste calls the learning spirit. And so she believes that the learning spirit is systematically and intergenerationally murdered through the colonial project. And what that means is that our sense of true, authentic learning to help us not only self-actualize, but work towards self-determination becomes disrupted. So we have to unlearn that. We have to become our authentic selves by disrupting these ways that our learning spirit, as Bettina Love calls, is murdered. And when we don't do this well, we're called weird, we're called odd, we're called wrong, we're called broken, we're called unorthodox. So, in many times, your very presence in spaces that have become traditionally withheld from you is not only unexpected, it becomes a threat. So in thinking about these ways that our learning spirits are murdered, what are the ways also that we're seen as threats just by existing? And so I found in my life that people have to painfully remind you, specifically me, of my place in the world. So I want you to notice that when I introduced myself, I didn't leave with a list of professional qualifications. You can Google all that. You can ask around. I've been active, involved member of the Oakland Bay Area community for a long time, so you can find all that stuff out. And you're all brilliant, so you could do that work. But despite my journey as a classroom teacher, as a school leader, as a community-based organizational leader, teacher educator, educational leader developer, I've not only accumulated various accolades and progressive opportunities, I've unfortunately accumulated a lifetime of both racial micro and macro aggressions. And serendipitously, that means I've gotten good at responding to them. But I still often wonder if that, instead of this photo that you see here of me at the Leading Educators Institute in New Orleans, that I wonder if when I walk into spaces, people only see me as my early college self. The reason why I kind of think this is because I frequently post-college, postdoctorates have gotten responses like this. Oh, you're a principal? Or whatever the job is. Oh, you're a teacher? Oh, you're an executive director? Oh, you're a professor? As if they're surprised. They would say, I didn't think that you would be a professor. I've heard even this right here. This idea. Oh, hold on real quick. I'm getting a little locked up. Sorry about that. Show my time. I got this in a yoga class. I wouldn't have thought that you had a PhD. And I get this all the time for as long as I can remember. You're so articulate. You're articulate. And of course, I've even got this. When I used to work at Stanford, 2 people said that I was unorthodox. The message to me is, I'm surprised you've done what you've done, given all those things. But I think what's important is, despite this journey, that I still have this higher ground, because I can see what's coming at me, I think, before it even starts to come. So look here. I think what's important is this idea that who I am and the essence of who I am is also in relationship with who I'm with. So in this photo here, you see a picture of me with Dr. Jamila Guerrero Cantor, who recently defended her dissertation in this photo here. And speaking of the intersectionality that Nnenna had talked about, her dissertation was called Dreamers Woke: Mexican Deaf Women Navigating College and Living as Undocumented. So when we talk about intersectionalities, the layers here are tremendous. These are the folks who I'm working to be in transformative solidarity with. Just like in this photo here with Dr. Farimapour Khorshid, or in this photo here with these gentlemen, Dr. Cliff Lee, Dr. Lamar Jackson, Dr. Danny Martinez, the homie Somas One here, child of the farm worker movement, also an MC and an educator. But look, don't let these photos with these scholar activists fool you. I'm still on the block. So whatever I'm doing, wherever I'm doing it with, I'm unapologetically embracing my unorthodoxy. Because what that politically does is that it says that the orthodox is oppressive. And so I want to challenge that orthodoxy by claiming and reclaiming my unorthodoxy. So I challenge you all, if you identify with this, to also embrace your unorthodoxy, because I want to affirm your humanity. Not that you need my affirmation, but oftentimes when we're said that we're unorthodox, that is a dehumanizing process. So take a look at this photo here. As we think about affirming, I want to start from this idea of the classroom space and what happens in that classroom space. Now, as you look at this photo here, think about where this was shot, when this was shot, think about what happens in this classroom, think about the relationships that this teacher has with the students, the relationship between the teacher and the purpose and structure of schooling to power, between what is taught and how it's taught. So as you think about that, I want to highlight that this photo was taken at the turn of the 20th century in the northern region of the Philippines called Luzon. And the teacher here, the white lady in the back right corner, was likely a former or even a current soldier. The basic gist of why there is a soldier acting as a teacher is because of this idea that the United States believed that in order to take over the country and annex it, that the best way to pacify the Filipino was to educate them. So what they realized that they had to do was control the tools of identity and self-identification. Just think about that for a moment. Control the tools of identity and self-identification in order to pacify the threats, the attacks, the assaults on our humanity. So let's teach them about their inferiority. So let's problematize this a little bit further. Let's start, excuse me, with this idea of pedagogy. So what is pedagogy? It's in my title. You might have heard a number of people talking about it, but I want to invoke Dr. Alison Tintiago Cubales, who talks about the idea that pedagogy is not just teaching. It's philosophy and practice of education that's informed by positionalities, ideologies, worldviews of both the teacher and the learner. And there are critical relationships involved here as well. Number one, it's about the purpose of education, the context of education, the content of what's being taught, and the methods of how it's being taught. Also, the people who are involved matters. The critical relationships between the identity of who's being taught and who's doing the teaching, and their relationships to structure and power. Now that whole ecology is what pedagogy is. And there's numerous different forms of pedagogy to get more precise into what it looks like within educational spaces. For example, you might have heard of critical pedagogy, culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogy, humanizing pedagogy, politically relevant pedagogy, enlaquesh pedagogy, sentipensante pedagogy, what I call a decolonial critical race pedagogy. And all of those pedagogies are part of this liberatory pedagogy that Shawn was talking about earlier. But what does that actually mean? Well, first we have to problematize the idea of liberation in the first place by asking this question. What do we need liberation from? When we talk about liberation from what? And I'm not going to tell you what that what is. I'll, if anything, provoke more questions for you. I'll plant some seeds for you. But you'll have to live into this answer of liberation from what? Including what is everything that I'm talking about today, what is everything that Nnenna and Shawn talking about, what does that mean to your context? That's the work that you have to do. It's my daughter and my son again over here at the Black Panther exhibit in the Oakland Museum. And I also want to highlight, in thinking about this idea about the Black Panther legacy and the work that they tried to do to counter the oppressive systems in the United States by reimagining a different way of being. Before talking about race and racism, we have to problematize these ideas by a process known as historicizing. When we think about historicizing, that is an action verb of looking at the patterns in history to create a problem. And so as we think about our children, we think about these Black and brown babies, I want to invoke the Black Panther Child's Pledge that goes like this. I will learn all that I can in order to help my people in their struggle for liberation. Historicizing is part of that process.
What we gonna do right here is go back, way back into time.
And so, in thinking about going way back, before talking about race and racism, I want to talk about and highlight this idea of miseducation, whether that's miseducation of the Negro from Carter G. Woodson, who, by the way, also was a school leader in the Philippines at that turn of the century. So he was like, oh man, look what's going on here with the United States abroad. And then rethinking this context in America, that's where this book came from, which also inspired Renato Constantino's The Miseducation of the Filipino. And these other texts here can help you go way back before thinking about race and racism, implicit bias, whatever it is that's on your minds right now in terms of what to do in this world that we're living in right now. Go to Albert Memmi, Colonizer and Decolonize, or Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, or Fanon's Black Skin, White Master, even Wretched of the Earth. And think about the ways in which hip hop music is also a project of trying to counter the miseducation that's done upon us in our schooling systems. And as we think about this idea that now here we are with this elephant in this room, let's put this front and center. What are we talking about when we talk about this elephant? Well, generally, there's a topic of conversation that's present in a room, but no one seems to be feeling comfortable enough to talking about it. So how do we become comfortable with being uncomfortable? Well, we have to normalize discomfort. as an important cultural process of growth. And we have to ask the critical question of this. When we think about how do we become comfortable with being uncomfortable, especially with elephants in the room, we have to ask the question, who put the elephants in the room in the first place? That it just happened out of nowhere and it was noticed. So how did that happen? And how do we get to a place of being culturally uncomfortable about talking about this in such a way where we can really understand it? And that is a process of working towards our liberation. And so again, uncomfortability is part of our culture. And we're talking about these subjects, these ideas that have been invisibilized so that we're not used to talking about them. Remember when I talked about the Mi'kmaq scholar, Marie Baptiste? She talked about the learning spirit. But also in this idea of the learning spirit was this idea of what we can do to reassemble that learning spirit. So when we think about colonialism, there's also the process of decolonializing things, or what some people call decoloniality. So I want to talk about this idea of senti pensante pedagogy, which is the idea that seeks wholeness of mind, body, heart, spirit, especially within the colonial project, that seeks to dismember us from our learning spirit, dismember our sense of feeling, dismember our traditions, our ways, dismember our history. So what does it mean for us to engage in the project of remembering these things here? And so rather than telling you what this decolonial critical race senti pensante pedagogy is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to immerse you in all of this. As we think about colonialism, which Shawn mentioned earlier, let me just make it intimate. Look, it disconnects you from peoples. It disconnects you from people who look like and sound like you. It diminutizes you. It makes you feel less than. It dispossesses you. It takes away your sacred land. It takes away your sacred water. When we look at the Dakota Access Pipeline, when we look at Mauna Kea, the list goes on and on. It takes away your stuff and it dismembers, as I already spoke about, in such a way that it makes you, it has to dictate the way what you think, how you think, what you become, how you become, what you be, how you be, what you do, how you do, what you feel, how you feel, what you know, how you know. It separates all that out, and it's rooted and centered around white supremacy. Now, moving from this idea of colonialism in its most intimate form that affects the body, or white body supremacy, as Shawn talked about earlier on, I want to remind us that the big homie Nipsey Hussle said, I spent my whole life trying to make it, trying to chase it. The cycle of a black man divided, trying to break it. So if we're constantly engaged in this cycle of recognizing a division and trying to break it, what does that look like for us as people who work with children who are starting out this process of being divided? How do we interrupt that cycle? I know you know the song right here. So if you remember the song, do the joint with me. So clap your hands, everybody. If you got what it takes, I'm Curtis Blow, and I want you to know that these are the breaks. Yeah. So check this out here. I want to introduce this idea of the breaks. So when Curtis Blow was talking about the breaks, he talked about the idea of physical stoppage that you put on the brakes. He talked about this idea about disruption or destruction, like you break things. He said, like, I need a break, or offering reprieve from everyday challenges, which opens up opportunities. Let's break things down. You make things accessible. You raise critical consciousness. Let's just get into this cipher and then just break, which is invoking improvisation, creativity, movement, and joyfulness. So what I want to do is I want to play off of this idea about these breaks and what does it mean for us to create cracks and fissures in the ways in which we dominantly think about things right now. And how we're going to do that is we're going to talk about this idea of breakdowns, breakups, and breakouts. So let's get into this real quick. Breakdowns. When we think about breaking things down, what we're going to practice is what does it mean to problematize situations, structures, and history instead of pathologizing people. Now, as people who hold a positional authority over young folks and even over families who are parents of those young folks, you have the power to make assumptions about who these people are in front of you. And what tends to happen, especially here in the United States, we engage in a culture of pathologizing the other who does not look like, sound like us. We look at them as deficit. We look at them as broken. We look at them as needing to be fixed. We look at them as they can't, they won't, they don't, they never will. So let's break this down. So instead of pathologizing people and groups of peoples, let's problematize situations, structures, and history. And the first, I want to go back to this Wing Lake over here. And I want to let you know that it was a hot day when we went here in Canada. And so we had to take this break, so we started to walk around. We walk around, we get, onto that landmass behind you over there, into some hills, and we're getting hot and thirsty. And we're like, oh, we got to find our way back downhill. We got to get some water. We need to refresh ourselves. So we find this lake here, Wing Lake. And in this lake, my daughter is looking down in the lake, and she sees these fish. And she goes to the fish. She says, hey, fish. And the fish looks up and says, what's up, kid? And my daughter says to the fish, hey, how's the water? And the fish looks up and says, what's water? What's water? The fish is so used to what they're in, they don't realize that they're in something called water. It's normal to them, it's natural to them, and therefore becomes invisible. So this is why we say, I'm used to it, or it's whatever, it is what it is. Because what that does is it makes us accustomed to the way things are. And we don't have to think twice about it. So we get used to things like, oh, women are put down in society. We get used to that. We get used to the way that folks of color are seen as inferior. We get used to that. We get used to the violence in and towards Black communities. We get used to that. It's just another Black man shot dead. We're used to that. We get used to immigration policing as normal, or that when more wealthier people buy homes in our working class neighborhoods and it gets harder and harder to afford rent and mortgage, we get used to that. Even the way we treated. Even if we're in positions of power, we get used to be constantly checked. This water is real. So the question is, who made the water that way in the first place? Not, is there water? Who made it that way? Let's stay in this lake here. So as we started to dip our feet into the lake, and we're harmonizing with the land, and we're feeling cooled off, my daughter notices the school of fish over here. They're gathering around a corner of that lake. And she's like, I wonder what they're doing. And then she starts to listen in to those fish. And she realizes that the fish, there's a school of fish, and they're in the 3rd grade, and they're about to have a spelling bee. And so my daughter is paying attention to this, and she notices the teacher is a beautiful goldfish named Miss Smith. And Miss Smith is, class, we're going to have a spelling bee. And she looks out into the class of fish and so forth. And she says, we need folks to practice. We'd like to practice first. So in the front row of the class is another beautiful golden fish, raises her fin and is like, I want to practice. And she says, Miss Smith says to the fish, to the kid, Leslie. Leslie's like, yes, Miss Smith. Leslie, spell cat. Leslie pauses for a moment, is like, cat. C-A-T, cat. Yes, absolutely correct, Leslie. You're brilliant. You'll go so far in life. Congratulations. That's absolutely correct. She looks out into the lake, and she sees another beautiful fish, a boy named Byron, and Byron raises his fin. It's like, I want to practice. And so, all right, Byron, spell dog. Byron pauses for a moment. It's like, dog. D-O-G. Yes, absolutely correct, Byron. You are brilliant. You'll go so far in life. You're so smart. Thank you so much. Miss Smith then looks out into the lake in her classroom. She sees in the back row another fish. It's just kind of swimming around, not paying attention, occasionally jumping up from the surface of the lake, and is playing with the frogs and the flies. And she says, Kevin, Kevin looks around. Yes, Miss Smith. Kevin, if you can't stop squirming around, if you can't stop not paying attention, if you can't focus, you'll never be anything in life. Do you want to be nothing? Kevin says, no, Miss Smith. Speak up. What's that? No, Miss Smith. All right, Kevin. Spell chrysanthemum. Kevin is in the spelling bee. He's in the class. He's in the lake. He can participate. Kevin might even win the spelling bee. He's included. And this is part of the rhetoric of our United States right now. But Kevin is expected to spell chrysanthemum, while the others are expected to spell cat and dog. And so I have to remind us that inclusion is not enough. We have to interrogate the question of what excluded us in the first place. And that's a liberatory project. Because look, we might be in this water, but when we throw rocks in that water, what happens? Ripples start to form. And we start to see the water a little bit more. But how do we see it? When we think about this idea of keep it 100, what we're talking about is keeping it real. And so we go back to throwing the pebbles in the water. What happens if your conception of reality is obscured? When we throw pebbles in that water, that toxic water, and we start to see it, we don't necessarily realize the toxicity, but we see the water. That becomes our reality still. That's where we get inured to it, used to it, normalized to it. That's where it's natural, and we even rationalize that to death. The point is this: oppression distorts how you see your reality. You think of it as truth, but what influences that truth? When we talk about good intentions, assume positive intentions, what if your intentions are rooted in something oppressive in the first place? So when we think about this idea here, look at this mural here that's over in Chicano Park in San Diego. My daughter is right here. So when we break up with things, it requires us to visibilize the invisibilize. And I was going to talk about
they
this.
teach me to erase that brown subconsciously.
I'm going to skip this one real quick here. What we need to break out from? What do we need to break down? Well, I think this idea of colonialism is like the original thug life, or the hate you give little infants F's everyone. And so when we think about like, why are you the way that you are, these kids that are in front of you? Well, Nipsey reminds us that we're not the cause, we're the effect. And so when we think about this idea of colonialism as the original thug life, or what some folks call coloniality, it's going to manifest in really intimate ways. It's going to dispossess you. It's going to say, I'm going to take you and your stuff. It's going to exploit you. I'm going to use all of you and your stuff to the fullest so that I could come up. It's going to separate, disconnect, dismember you. I'm going to get you to not know you, your peoples, your culture, your history, your knowledge, your land. It's going to eradicate and erase. It's going to say, I'm going to get rid of all the evidence, get y'all to forget about the evidence by killing off some of y'all, miseducating and kicking the rest of y'all to the curb. I'm going to miseducate you. I'm gonna flip the script, get you to believe that you nothing, that we everything, that you should feel guilty or shame for not being nothing, that everything we done was for your own good, and then set up the system to get all of this to stay happening. And then I'm gonna get you to hate and fight each other and say, it's whatever, when you think about any of this. And then I'm gonna move into your spot. I'm gonna kick you out to the curb so that you can't afford to be here anymore. I'm gonna make you think that you're nothing for not being able to stay here anymore. And then I'm gonna get everybody to think that I'm making all of this better. That's thug life, right? So when we think about colonialism as a process, well, look what it's rooted in. It's rooted originally in European supremacy. And what had to happen is that in order to establish supremacy, there had to be an invention of race. And when you have this structure of race, then you could have this process of racism. Similarly, colonialism also built on the idea or the ideology that we get to own stuff. And that's where you need a structure called capital. And when you have capital, you already know then you can have this process called capitalism. And then if they had a baby, racism and capitalism, then you get neoliberalism. And so And so when we think about this idea, like how do we break out from all this? I want to take you into this construct called the matrix. And inside this matrix here that's completely fabricated, we're going to build this house. And in this house, we're going to start off with this foundation. We're going to build the structure. We're going to have the rooms. We're going to start building the edifice. We're going to start going ahead and putting up the ceiling, the roof, and everything like that. But let's call this house white supremacy, or similarly anti-blackness. As a foundation, if you're in this house, in the matrix, you're always walking around in whiteness, in anti-blackness. And as you start to erect the framing of the house, then you need this structure called race. You have to be able to separate who's white and who's non-white, who's white, who's black. And when you have this structure of race, then you have to have this layout of rooms. And when you have these rooms, those enable processes to happen to further what you do on this foundation. And that's called racism. Racism is a process to perpetuate white supremacy. And racism is elusive, it's super complicated. And so there's multiple forms that you can see here about racism. You heard about, Shawn was already talking about microaggressions and implicit bias already. So these are just some of those forms. But as we think about racism, a lot of folks want to just start with this place of white privilege. But you can't talk about white privilege unless you also talk about racism, unless you also talk about white supremacy. But if you start to racialize white folks and you start chipping away at this really robust exterior, what happens is it feels like your ceiling is going to collapse. That's where white rage, white fragility, white guilt, white emotionality comes from. It feels like, oh my gosh, I can't be racist. I didn't ever own slaves and so forth. You know, like, oh, I don't have culture, all these different types of things, because you're not comfortable with being racialized in the ways that we've been born into it as folks of color. And all this becomes natural and normal. And so please, I want to encourage you to stop worrying about if you might be seen as racist, because all of us, if we're in this matrix, in this house, we're walking on the same foundation. So we have to then pay attention to racist thinking, racist behaviors, racist policies, racist language. We could all enact this. And as we think about that, it's important to realize the role of language. Language choice and how that language is used has been weaponized. And similarly, this idea of I feel threatened has been weaponized. This is also part of the language, especially when it comes from white folks, to be able to enact state-sanctioned aggression against people of color. And I won't spend too much time on this, but this process of historicizing says that what happened between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in Central Park was not an isolated incident. There's a history of the imagination of the black man in the white person's mind as being even more dangerous than any black man in the world. And there's a pattern of that construction. I won't talk too much about this post here, but other than to say that this came from a high school principal in Florida. Also, this was quoted also in Bettina Love's book, and she quoted this song about vigilantism. Take all the rope in Texas, find a tall oak tree, round up all the bad boys, hang them high in the street for all the people to see. And then when this principal got backlash, she said, I'm absolutely devastated that my personal political views were perceived to be racist in any way. It continues to justify the ways in which she had made this post and rationalize it. If you haven't seen the film, The 13th, I encourage you to look at that film because it also engages in a process of historicizing the ways in which we are where we are today. It didn't come out of anywhere. So what I do want to do is I want to get us to a place of breaking out. And what does it mean to reframe and reimagine? I want to introduce these liberatory tools for you all. The first of which is problematizing. I mentioned this a number of times, but problematizing says, why are things the way that they are in the first place? And how do we use historicizing to help us in that practice? And as we problematize things, then what do we need to visibilize? And we ask the question, what critical analysis can shed light on this situation? And then we can engage into a project of reframing, or asking the question, how might we be able to shift the gaze to think about the situation differently from the dominant? And when we're able to reframe things, then we can break out and reimagine. Given this analysis and reframed way to think about the situation, how might we imagine how things could be? As we think about this, I won't have too much time to really go into this idea, but when we think about keeping it 100, it makes it seem like you're woke, you're not woke. It's like a switch. But what does it mean to be in this process of woking? Or rather, how do you continually make it 100? And so bravery, in essence, is this. We need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Shawn talked about this idea about being in your body. So how do we remember radical mindfulness and the ways in which our body is responding to talking about these uncomfortable things? And then as we start to get laced up, how do we practice precision both in our behaviors and in our language to be able to help reframe things and engage in visibilizing the invisibilized and reminding ourselves that we need to problematize, not pathologize people. And when we do that, we are then able to reimagine, to redefine, to reinculturate, reroute for you, for me, and the next 7 generations. And we have to do that in transformative solidarity. And what I mean by transformative solidarity, I want to build from this idea that right now in this current climate, a lot of people are claiming solidarity because maybe they have the Black Lives Matter sign, or maybe they go to a George Floyd, Breonna Taylor caravan, right? And then maybe they take some selfies about them being there, and then they go home to resume life as it was. But embedded in transformative solidarity is reciprocity as both process as well as aim. Transformation occurs as a process within individuals or groups while engaging in the solidarity work. Transformation as aim are the intended results within that socio-cultural context that contains those individuals and groups. In other words, transformative solidarity means that we have to be in process of supporting a movement while also being in process of transforming our own selves. This is the co-conspirator or the accomplice that Nnenna as well as Bettina Love was talking about. And then we could reimagine. And when we think about our communities that have been historically pathologized, and thinking about the ways in which it's been constructed as places of death, places of pathology, I want to remind us that if you break through this concrete here, these constructions, underneath that is soil that could be cultivated. And when we cultivate that soil, what folks don't realize is that you can't bury us because we're seeds. And as I close this out, I want you to say as loud as you can in your own context, repeat after me. C, H, R, Y, S, A, N, T, H, E, M, U, M. Chrysanthemum. And let's reframe thug life to be the hope you give little infants, frees everyone. Thank you.
All right, let's give Dr. G a big virtual hand. That was awesome. I appreciate everyone who came back from session 1 to session 2 and who stayed. So we do have a few questions, Dr. G. The first one says, I hear so often, my family didn't own slaves, but possibly you and your family benefits from white privilege today and in the past. How can we speak to this?
I think part of speaking to this is being able to get educated on the architecture of why were slaves created in the first place. And if we could understand the way why they were created in the first place and how that we can historicize that practice in different iterations, whether that's Jim Crow, segregation, state-sanctioned murder, et cetera, then that will allow us to be able to rethink how we can speak to this. Again, I want you all to really ask these kinds of questions, but more importantly, live into these answers. Because once you start to interrogate it, then you can visibilize the invisibilized. Then you could reframe, and then you could reimagine or speak to this.
Would it be okay if I added to that, Dr. G?
Of course.
I just want to add to the person who asked the question, a couple of things around privilege, prejudice, and power. imagine privilege as, oh, this is for everyone who's still listening. Imagine privilege as walking up a steep hill and the wind is at your back. So the wind is actually elevating you and pushing you up that hill. And imagine someone on the other side of that hill walking up the hill without the wind in their back, but they're pushing a big rock up that same hill. So consider that, and consider the person with the wind at their back who says, my family didn't own slaves. It's really the individualistic thinking. Remember, I went back to those bias-based beliefs that says, if you see me as an individual, then I need you to remove me from the system that exists that we're all in. So if you remove me from the system, then I'm excused. And I'm going to give you a response that says, my family didn't own slaves, which says that person's really articulating this individualism that says they don't understand the system that makes them state, my family didn't own slaves. So that's how I would enter that courageous conversation, by doing what I call calling them in, calling them out, and then calling them back in.
That's right.
The power of three. The others are comments. Oh, she addressed that. The others, they're all comments. They're not real questions. Oh, wait a minute. I have a question, Dr. G. How can you talk about our non-Black minority family members who believe Black Lives Matter is not our fight? That's what the question says.
I think similar to what you had mentioned before, is how do we elevate the idea of the American rhetoric as being what a meritocracy and individualism, realizing that what we need to do is we need to aspire to obtain that which whiteness tries to promise us, but can never actually deliver to us as non-white people. And then how do we then see that my struggle is tied directly with your struggle? So me as a non-phenotypically Black person, how do I see my struggle as tied to those who are Black?
Yeah. And I think I'm gonna add to that also. I think exposure helps change it for folk, because there are people around the globe who, and I'm going to be really transparent, as I started to travel outside the United States, and people would basically identify themselves to me as Black. And in my head, I would think, you're not Black, or you are Black, after I would never think. So the limiting experience of how people identify in this solidarity on the global scale, I think can help change that thinking for people around having the limited experience of what we believe is the United States isn't the global experience that I think people who live and breathe on other continents in how they see and experience Blackness. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, and I'd like to just go back to some of the ideas earlier about the structure of white supremacy, this, colonialism as process, racism as process. It has to make us fight each other. It has to make us see who is the non-model minority. If you're going to have a model minority, you have to have a non-model minority. It needs to create this dismemberment. And so continue to grapple with this idea as you're being complicit to white supremacy by seeing that Black Lives Matter is not your fight.
Mm-hmm. Great. Awesome. Well, this was fantastic. And I was getting text messages and emails from people while you were speaking and looking at the comments. I think people were really activated by Nnenna and you, Dr. G, going from part 1 to part 2. And like we said, for you ECE specific folk, look out for some information, and I'll definitely share it with First Five so they can then push it on around some longer individual presentations specific to early childhood strategies and practices, and how we can take deeper dives for ourselves, the families, and the children within the system, schools, and structures that we all work and live within. So remember the evaluation, take a breath before you complete it. The presenters will read your comments, so just think about what you're really wanting to communicate, and you will get a professional certificate. Leah handles all of that. For those who tweeted and put it on Facebook, Leah, Beth, and I will look at those, and then we will DM you for those who, there'll be one each. So if you post it on Twitter for first 5, if you post it on Facebook for first 5, there'll be one each. And if you post it on Teaching Excellence Center for Twitter and Teaching Excellence Center for Facebook, we'll look out to you. Okay? Thank you all so much. And
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shawn. Thank you for bringing the panelists together.